Today we're looking at 5 of the most common JavaScript mistakes that I see. These can be either actual bugs or just sort of stylistic issues that can make your code much harder to understand. So first of all, here we have an object. It's called channel. It has 2 properties. We have name with Connor Ardman, and we have subscriber count at 11,000, and then we log out channel.subscriberCount. So you might expect that this is going to log out 11,000, but this is actually our first bug. So if I run this code, we are just going to get reference error count is not defined. So what is happening here? Well, if we look at this code, we see console.log channel.subscriber and then this dash and then count. But the dash is the subtraction operator in JavaScript. So really this does channel.subscriber, which is going to be undefined, and then it does minus count, which gives a reference error because we do not have a count variable. So there's a few ways to fix this. First of all, if you can't change the object, then instead of using dot notation, you need to use bracket notation and put this in quotation marks, and this would actually work. Alternatively, the better thing to do is just avoid using dashes in object properties. So we could even get rid of the strings if we don't have dashes, and we could do something like subscriber count camel cased, and then we can go back to using the dot notation, and of course this would work. The next common bug is related to dealing with asynchronous code. So here we can see we make a fetch request to some temperature API, and then we get the response and parse it as JSON, and then we take that JSON and we save the temperature from JSON, so json.temperature, in this temperature global variable up here, and then after all that we log out the temperature. But the result of this is actually going to be that it will log out undefined. And the reason it logs out undefined is because this code is not going to wait for this fetch request to come back. The fetch statement just calls fetch and returns a promise, and once that promise resolves, so once the request comes back, then this code will be able to run. But this code is always going to run first, and thus that will be undefined. So to solve this, we can simply move this into the .then. That would probably be the simplest thing to do. Alternatively, we can convert this to using async await, and we can await the call to fetch as well as the call to response.json, and that would also solve the problem. Okay, so next up we have this add function, and we can see it takes in an array and it returns the total sum of all of the values. And then it's going to, inside of the function, iterate through the array, keeping track of the current total and the current value, and then we return array.reduce, and this is going to return the current total plus the current value. And the issue here is not a bug. This code actually does work, but it's more about this over-commenting thing. I see a lot of people, especially beginners, commenting every single line of code like, I need to make sure that either I in the future know what this does, or future developers know what this does. But we don't need to comment things that are completely obvious. Instead, we should just comment things when a new developer looking at it might be curious as to why you made a decision that you made, or something might be unclear. But here, for example, we don't need to say what returning does or what addition does. It's very obvious. We also don't need to explain what array.reduce is because that's just a built-in function. If somebody's reading this and they don't know, they can go look up what that function does. But we should write code assuming people know the standard libraries of the languages we are using. And then we also have this comment describing what the function does. And personally, I don't think this is necessary. Instead, we can just use good function names. So for example, instead of add, we could say sum. And when sum takes in an array, I think it's very obvious that this is going to take in this array and return the total value of all of the values in that array, or a sum of those values. Next up, we have this isEven function that takes in a number. It says if the number mod 2 is 0, return true, otherwise return false. And this function works as you would expect, but the issue here is something that's often called bad Boolean Zin. And the idea is simply that this here is a Boolean, that's why it works in an if check, and the return value is true, which is only going to happen if this is true, otherwise we return false. So really all we need to do is say return number mod 2 is strictly equal to 0, and this would do the exact same thing. So we can delete all of this code, and this is just much cleaner code, much simpler. We don't need the extra if checks, and it does the exact same thing. Next up, we have a super common bug. So here we have a function first even number that takes in an array. and it loops over this array using for each, and for each number it checks if the number is even, and if it is, it returns the number. And then we log out first even number with 1, 2, 3, 4 passed in. And you might think that this is going to return 2 because 2 is the first even number. But if I run this, we see we actually get undefined. So why do we get undefined? Well, we return number inside of array.forEach, but array.forEach takes in a function. So that means that this function here returns number, but that number is not being passed up to this outer function. So if we do want to return in the outer function from this inner function, the easiest thing to do is just not use for each. And instead what we can do is we can say for const number of array and do it this way with a more traditional for of loop. We would move this in here and then get rid of the for each lines. And now if I run this, we do get 2 as we expect. And now that is the last of these bugs, but if you do want to see 5 things you should be doing in JavaScript, check out this video next.